Welcome to Insights for IT Negotiations, a podcast by UpperEdge, a leading IT sourcing, negotiation, and project execution advisory firm. I'm John Belden, UpperEdge's Chief Research and Strategy Officer.
And I'm Kylie Chisholm, UpperEdge's Marketing Manager. Join us every other week as we share insights to help you maximize the value of your key IT relationships. In each episode, we'll delve into the topics that matter most to IT decision makers and sourcing professionals. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our episode of Insights for IT Negotiations. I am joined by my co-host, John Belden. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing outstanding today, Kylie.
Great.
So, hey, Kylie, I'm really excited about the guest that we've got on today. One of the things that we've talked about previously on this podcast is this concept of indirect generative AI, right? And indirect generative AI, by our definition, is how do you extract the value of generative AI with minimal technology investments as a company. And I think the guest that we've got on today, before you introduce him, he's recently written a blog specifically kind of targeted at this subject, right? So I'm really excited to have our guest on today.
So let's introduce our guest without further ado. So today we're talking to Scott Braverman. Scott is on the managed services team here at UpperEdge. And to John's point, he just recently published his first UpperEdge blog since joining the team on generative AI's impact in field services. I worked closely with him on this blog. I know we were super excited to see it come from a marketing standpoint because we haven't really dove into this topic yet at UpperEdge. So Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Kylie, for that intro, and thanks, John, for having me on. Really appreciate it. Really excited for this conversation today. Really can't wait. It was a blog that came directly from our experiences with clients. So I think we'll have a good conversation today, and hopefully will be useful for all your listeners.
Yeah, so Scott, just to get started, I mean, why don't you talk a little bit about the organization that you work with and for, right within UpperEdge? What is that organization? What services do they provide, et cetera?
Yeah. So I'm aligned to, as Kylie said, our managed services practice here at UpperEdge. So our main focus is on supporting clients through optimizing their spend with their managed services providers being any of those large organizations that are essentially that our clients outsource their work to. So this could be anyone from, Accenture, EY, Deloitte, could be some of the India-based firms like Cognizant, Wipro, so on and so forth. And so our goal is to put our clients in the best position to optimize their spend, optimize their commercials. So in terms of the contracts that they're signing, ensuring that there's minimal risk involved when it comes to the service levels that they're agreeing to with their managed service providers, and then helping them through that negotiation to ensure that they're really getting that optimal position. So we work through clients going through RFIs, RFPs, clients going through sole source solicitations for renewals. We're here to help our clients through those negotiations.
Yeah, so when you say managed services, Scott, kind of break that down for me, right? Because managed services can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, right? So, is there a way that you can kind of frame it and say, hey, these are the four things, or these are the five things that traditionally are considered managed services?
Yeah, absolutely, John. It is a great question because it is such a vague term, managed services. The way we break it out is actually into 8 different towers. So I won't necessarily go through all 8 of them, but just to give you a flavor of that. So this covers any areas such as application maintenance services. So if an organization wants to outsource the support and the maintenance of, say, an SAP environment, for example, they might outsource that to an Accenture, to a Wipro, Cognizant, whoever that is. So that's one of the towers, is with application maintenance. And that's kind of its own tower on its own, where it's specific to supporting of that software component. And then there's 7 additional towers, which are all related to infrastructure and operations. We call it I&O. So this could be anything from, like we're talking about today, field services, where organizations are outsourcing the support of their locations. Could be retail stores if it's a retailer, could be bank locations if it's a financial services institution. So field services is just one of those 7 I&O. Other ones, just to give you an idea, could be data center compute services. So supporting an organization's server storage environment, could be even mainframe potentially. Could be application hosting services is another one of the towers. Um, so those are just a few. Network could be another one. So it's a really broad subject. So that's why I'm so glad you asked that, John, just to explain that. But those are kind of the specific areas where we're helping clients.
Now, is the help desk in general considered part of field services, or is that something that's independent of field services?
We look at help desk independent of field services, but it's a
Okay.
great question because there is certainly some overlap there between the two, and there's overlap between all of the INO. But we look at service desk and help desk as kind of a separate tower from field services.
Okay. All right. So the field services now. I think I understand it then. So it makes perfect sense because companies can't necessarily have their IT department all over the United States or all over the world, right? So they are dependent on the local IT departments of the various vendors that are then addressing multiple customers in a particular city or something like that. Then is that fair?
That's exactly right. And I think usually the way that the field services can be thought of is there's a few different components. One of them is just your standard maintenance of those specific locations, right? Making sure that, if something breaks, that the managed service provider can come and fix that and can do it in a timely fashion that's agreed upon with the service levels that you have with them.
Okay.
There's also, special projects that, there's always things that come up at locations, new initiatives where the managed service provider might help out set up a new cash register, for example,
Okay.
for a peak period. And then also, just setting up if there's a new store and you need to stage and install that store with all of the IT equipment to make sure that they're ready to go when they're either opening or with new equipment or what have you. So those are kind of the three areas of field services where we see
So,
MSPs really step in and help out.
so when we're MSP is what?
Managed service provider.
Okay. And just bear with
Sorry,
me
I
here
should have
when
said
I ask these. Are the field service contracts, um, do we see them typically as a component of a larger managed service agreement, or are these contracts independent of the managed service agreement, and whoever your managed service provider is may not be your field service providers? I mean, talk to me a little bit about the nature of the relationship there.
Yeah, it could be both, to be honest, John. Some clients will use the same managed service provider for other INO areas, infrastructure and operations, and use that same provider for field services. I think what's maybe a little bit more common is field services is separate because
Okay.
what we've seen is that there can be a lot of fragmentation in terms of who our clients are using for certain services. So it is typically separate, but just to give you an example, one client might use one managed service provider to help with staging installation services, right? Setting up that store for North America, but they might use a different provider that has capabilities in that what we call that break fix side, which is more of that maintenance side. So it can be fragmented, but that's something that we love to talk about with clients is understanding if the structure that they have in place works for them or if there's any optimization that can be done via consolidation of providers or consolidation of contracts.
Okay. All right, very good. I appreciate you taking the time to kind of explain that whole space to our
Of
listeners
course.
then. So let's well one additional question on that when we're talking about field services. You've mentioned a few vendors, right? You mentioned Accenture, you mentioned Cognitives. I mean, who are the 5 to 7 key vendors that we most often see in this space?
Yeah, so I would say, it is kind of the big players that you would expect for the most part, right? Accenture, Deloitte, and then also some of the India-based firms that I mentioned, like Cognizant is a big player, Wipro as well. One other provider that is huge in this space that field services really is their focus is NCR. That's
Okay.
one that we've seen clients go to, and their expertise has really stuck out to a lot of clients as kind of at that top tier of providers that you wouldn't necessarily think about. But besides NCR, it is kind of those typical managed service providers that you would
Yeah.
expect.
Funny story about NCR. They were the first company that I actually ever interviewed for when I was in college.
No way.
Uh, yeah, they were the first company that I interviewed for. And it was really funny because the interview didn't go exactly as planned. because they had asked me during the interview how I felt about programming in assembly language, because that's what they do at the time. And I said, "There's no way I want to do any programming in assembly language." And I saw the guy writing that down, and I said, "Well, there's no way I'm going to get no way I'm going to get an offer for NCR." So just kind of a funny offshoot in that space.
That's funny. Hey, you were honest.
So so let's go back to the kind of the broader topic now of generative AI, right? And thinking about generative AI as it applies to the field services space. I mean, where are we seeing the opportunities? Where are companies kind of saying, "Hey, we think we can actually generate some savings in this area"?
Yeah, and if I could, John, just a quick note on how we're seeing Gen AI and managed services as a whole is that the managed services area, the providers have been hesitant, might not be the right word, but maybe deliberate in the way that they're trying to infuse generative AI into their solutions. And I think what our team has talked about is it seems like there's some hesitations or some concerns that they might be cannibalizing their own revenue by implementing Gen AI, right? Because it's going to make them more efficient, and therefore they can't charge as much. But so I think if we think about field services in particular, there's a couple of buckets that I think about it. Obviously, generative AI can help with a lot of kind of call them simpler tasks, right? So this is automation of scheduling and dispatching of resources that go to the sites, or it could be streamlining of how and this is where kind of that overlap comes with services, but there's streamlining of how they're supporting ITSM ticketing and support, right? So there's the automation of those simpler tasks, which can generate some efficiencies, but then there's also some of the more transformative ideas that we're seeing, which could be like proactive support for remote monitoring and predictive maintenance of IT equipment at store locations, or even risk mitigation for loss prevention. So I think those are kind of the two buckets to think of. And of course, that's just a high level, topside view of it. But what's interesting, John, is we're seeing kind of similar ideas from these providers when we're seeing them propose these generative ideas to clients. There's kind of a similar train of thought that these are kind of the two general areas, and then those specific areas that I touched on are the ones that they're really focusing in on, and those are the ones that seem to be able to they think and the customers think can provide the most immediate value.
Yeah, what you're saying about field services it's clearly, I mean, it's aligned with, I'll call it, the rest of the IT industry, right? When we have um, incumbent, let's call it incumbent providers of anything related to the services, whether it be a project or managed services, etc. Um, there is clearly a we need to protect our revenue component to negotiating with those particular providers, um, and lots of far better results when we see vendors in a competitive scenario, right, where they're having to now compete for that business, especially when we talk about the long term opportunities and the potential savings opportunities that exist, not just in the next 6 months, but in the next 2 years or 3 years, and really pushing them along that line of expected productivity gains, and kind of pushing them down that path. So when we think about the field services, then, right, how should clients, and what are the steps that clients should be taking in preparation for, I'll call it, negotiating with these field service providers in order to be able to build a foundation that you can actually negotiate from?
Did you know that UpperEdge offers subscription advisory services? This on-demand solution provides essential benchmarks and market insights specific to your business needs precisely when you need it, empowering you and your team to make informed decisions for your IT initiatives. Position your team for success. Reach out today via the link in the show notes to learn more.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And when we're talking to clients and organizations, obviously generative AI is a pretty hot button topic right now. But what we've seen is that really first organizations need to take stock of their current environment and their current landscape with their field services providers. And could be one field service provider, could be many. And understand, first of all, what services are they providing? What type of maintenance are they providing for us? What types of projects are they helping us implement? So get an understanding of what they're doing for your organization today, and then also understand what tasks associated with field services is your organization performing today, and in support of that as well. And then, get an understanding of if those services you want to continue to support internally or you want to outsource those to a managed service provider. So getting that viewpoint of what your usage looks like today is kind of that first step before you can kind of jump in to implementing a generative AI tool. And then kind of from there, John, it's understanding how good your business feels about the work being done today, and if there are any roadblocks in performing field services, right? If the business doesn't feel good about the current services, if there are roadblocks or issues that the team is facing, then that's really needs to be caught before you go down this path, because that's really what's going to drive an understanding of where generative AI is really going to make the most impact for you. And it's certainly possible that AI could help with some of these issues, but what we're seeing is that addressing these concerns upfront via either bidding the business to a different provider, entering into a competitive bid like you're talking about, or even just approaching your incumbent and looking to renegotiate your contract is going to be a more immediate path to value and set you up for more success when you do decide to go down the path of leveraging generative AI for field services. So just to summarize, it's get an understanding of what your current environment looks like, what your current pain points are, address those now, and then kind of decide to go from there.
Yeah, and I think another thing, Scott, in this space that might be beneficial to our clients is in order to be able to perhaps generate leverage, right, of on the field services providers. Um, I think it's really, and it goes along the lines of your assessment here, right? But I believe it also is understanding what the potential impact of generative AI is on your internal organization, right? And the actual perhaps demand for field services to say maybe I'm not going to need as much in the future as what I need today if I actually can take advantage of, let's say, generative AI internally. Now, that goes counter to the, oh, I'm going to get a whole bunch of savings indirectly and not have to spend anything on generative AI. But if you do the assessment to be able to say, this is the value that I can generate internally with the application of generative AI, and maybe I don't need as much field services, to the extent that you as a client can demonstrate that to your field services provider, that says, maybe I don't need you as much anymore if I implement these things, right? Kind of forces their hands to be able to say, well, I can come back and deliver this at a lower cost. Maybe you don't have to implement those things internally, right? But it's kind of creating the atmosphere of, and I'll call it the leverage of negotiations.
Absolutely. It is such a great leverage point to go through that exercise internally that you can take to your managed service providers. You put it perfectly. I really, really don't have much else to add, but it's such a great and key leverage point you can take. And it allows you to really pressure test what your provider's saying from an effort
Well,
perspective. Is
yeah,
this,
and you
can
got to
we
do
do
your
better?
homework though, right? You got to do your
Got to
homework.
do the homework.
You can't just say, "Oh, I could implement generative AI and not need as much as you." You've got to be able to demonstrate it with some authority that I've done the work, right?
100%.
That creates the FUD, right? The fear, uncertainty, and
Yeah,
doubt, right? So
that's right.
when organizations go through this, then how should they think about prioritization of the costs and the benefits associated with it?
Yeah. So I think, and again, just going back to what we were talking about earlier, a huge reason why it's important. Of course, it's important in every area of IT, but specifically for working with your managed service provider is because, like I was saying, it is early and it's not exactly clear how they're going to approach this. So going through kind of the due diligence, right? We don't know. It's not like a service now where they have a line item that says generative AI and here's your cost. It's not going to be that way with your managed service provider. It's going to be getting an understanding of how will cost benefits of generative AI be passed on to your organization if you are to leverage a provider's tool, right? Because like we're talking about, the key benefit of Gen AI implemented in pretty much any area is improved efficiency. So there needs to be that clear roadmap when you are looking at a proposal, understand how the efficiencies that your MSP, managed service provider, will have in delivering field services and how those cost efficiencies will be passed on to your organization. And this is something, something your provider should currently be doing in your contract, regardless of Gen AI, right? As you get to know from the managed service provider perspective, as you get to know your customer better, you're able to deliver efficiencies in delivering the services and meeting the service levels that you're agreeing to. But we'd expect these to be even more advanced productivity improvements achievable via AI. So, I mean, to your point, it's pressure testing when you get a proposal and you see those productivity improvements and you have done your homework and understand from your perspective what those can look like. That's where that's really the key point to look at in terms of optimizing your cost and making sure that you're getting the most out of that relationship.
Scott, have we seen proposals where um, vendors are explicitly indicating where they're implementing generative AI and how they're looking to recover any of the costs associated with that implementation?
We haven't yet. Part of that again being kind of it's still early for them, but we're going through a project right now with a client who went through the RFI stage and asked for some generative AI. Uh, the high level, how are you going to approach leveraging generative AI to support us? So we're hoping to see how this kind of plays out. It's going to be really interesting. But this is kind of going back to my earlier point too. This client's focused on ensuring that their field services footprint before going down the generative AI path is in an optimal state to be able to go down that route. So we haven't quite seen it yet. Partly due to hesitation of the provider, partly due to this project that we're working on just hasn't gotten to that point yet.
Yeah. So one of the things, that we've advocated to clients in the past, and I would be interested to know if you believe it'll work in the managed service space, right?
Mhm.
Is and maybe we get into this in the discussion of risks, right? But one of the things that we've advocated to clients in the past is understanding the risk profile of generative AI is actually a mechanism to create leverage on your vendor to be transparent with their actual use of generative AI so that you know where in fact you can actually put pressure on them. So, and one of the things that we've used I'll call it in the project space is to be able to say, and I'm just going to take coding as an example, right? We know that there's a certain amount of risk associated with generative AI in the creation of code. Okay, and it might be working code, but it may not be efficient. There may be problems associated with the code that are buried into that code. And when a vendor is using generative AI and creating code in that fashion, they effectively are passing that risk onto the client with the product that they have created. And so what we advocate is, Mr. Vendor, we don't care if you're going to use generative AI, but we need you to be very transparent with where you're actually applying that generative AI because you are now creating a risk point for us as an organization with your application of that, right? And so we need you to be transparent with that application of generative AI so we're aware of those risks. And in doing so, now they're obligated to tell you where they're using generative AI. And so now we can zero in on the potential for savings under the guise of sharing in the risk. Does that principle make sense in the space of field services?
Absolutely, it does, John. And kind of as I was saying too, it's because it is still early and it's not exactly clear how it's going to happen. It's not like generative AI is going to be a line item on your quote. That is such a great way to approach it, and it's all factual. There is a lot of risk involved with generative AI
Right.
and understanding how it's being used. So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think it's the managed service space as a whole, and specifically field services, is the perfect application for that strategy.
Yeah. So can you think about then some of the risks that might manifest themselves with generative AI in the field services areas that would be useful then to say, okay, we're going to figure out a way to insert this into negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a few different risks to think of, but for the purposes of this, I mean, it's I think not too dissimilar from other areas too, right? It's how is the managed service provider? What are they doing with my data, right? So pulling in your security teams and your legal teams as kind of part of that conversation is the way that you can kind of approach that, right? It's what are you doing with my data? How am I benefiting from this? Am I seeing the cost benefits that you're seeing from the commercial side as well? So that's kind of how we would suggest to go about it: is pull in kind of your backup with you as part of that conversation to say we can't move forward with this deal unless we get our concerns addressed around security and around kind of the legal aspects of that too, and then kind of take that from there to ensure that you're protected from risk, but then you can also get that commercial side to and understand how they're pricing it and what benefits you're seeing.
Yeah, those are really great points in terms of thinking through the risks. So, Scott, is there, one or two pieces of advice now, as we're wrapping up this conversation that you said, hey, if there's, I always remember the times that I've got asked by CEOs in the past when I was doing great big projects, if there's one thing that I have to get right here, what is that one thing? So I'm going to ask you that same question, right? When we think about field services and we think about generative AI, if there's one thing that you want to leave our listeners with, what's that one thing?
I think it's, and not to be repetitive of what we've already talked about, but it's really that productivity cost benefit analysis. How is my provider, if they're going to leverage their Gen AI tool, how are they going to benefit us, and how are the efficiencies that they're gathering going to be passed on to us, right? That's the key point with your managed service provider to think about.
So, all right, very good. And Kylie, maybe we can wrap us up then in terms of our conversation today and where the listeners can find additional information.
Yeah. So thank you both for that great conversation. The blog that we've mentioned that Scott authored will be linked below, as well as our managed services advisory practice page. We highly recommend you check that out if you think we could help with your MSP relationships or negotiations. And we'll have additional MSP related content linked below as well. And yeah, thank you guys both again for the great conversation, and we'll see our listeners next time.
Thank you for listening to Insights for IT Negotiations. This episode was hosted by John Belden and Kylie Chisholm and produced by Mike Brown. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss a new episode. For more information on IT sourcing and risk management strategies, visit UpperEdge.com and subscribe to our monthly UpperEdge newsletter. Thank you for listening.